We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hello, and welcome to After America. We're flipping the script this week, and your regular host, Dr. Emma Shortis, is our guest. My name is Alice Grundy. I'm a research manager at the Australia Institute, and I'll be your host. We're going to be talking about the campaign and some of the fragile egos that we've seen on display, and we'll also be talking about that hot mic incident with Prime Minister Albanese. So, Emma, what's been going on in the race this week?
Well, Alice, it's actually been what feels like a weirdly quiet week. I think because, there's been so much drama in the last few months of the campaign. Things seem to have really settled down this week, which again when we compare it to other election cycles, is a bit strange as well, because it was Labor Day in the United States last week, and that's usually considered the kind of unofficial campaign kickoff. People are back from summer holidays. It's when they start really paying attention to American politics and when their campaigns ratchet up. But again, weirdly, what's happened is things have kind of seemed to have settled down after the drama of the assassination attempt and the debate and Harris becoming the nominee. And the two campaigns have really been focusing on actually campaigning. So Harris and Walz have been focusing on the blue wall, what's called the blue wall states. So Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They've been campaigning there with a big focus on union engagement. So talking to teachers' unions, nurses' unions, the United Auto Workers Union as well, which of course is pretty powerful in the movement. And so they've been focused on that and kind of the middle class and working class Americans, while Trump is being Trump.
We're learning new details about an incident that turned physical at Arlington National Cemetery.
The U.S. Army is criticizing the Donald Trump campaign today over a controversial visit to Arlington National Cemetery earlier this week. It said there was an incident involving a cemetery official after Trump's team broke the rules by filming and taking photos in an area considered off-limits.
Arlington is the final resting place of the men and women who sacrificed for their country. Its rules are not mere suggestions. They honor that sacrifice.
Chanel, it's something that I think those of us following every minute detail of this see as sort of a unforced error. It's one of those instances where a campaign does something and kind of gets themselves in a corner.
It's just so disgusting. And I'll tell you, if you haven't noticed, I get a lot of publicity. I don't need that publicity. I don't need that publicity. I get a lot. I get too much.
Doesn't have a huge number of engagements on his schedule. Has been pretty busy on social media, saying exactly what you would expect and having a fairly typical incident, maybe, I guess we could call it, at the Arlington National Cemetery, which he was allegedly using to make political and campaign content, which is very much against the rules and the kind of standards of behaviour of American politics. So kind of business as usual, I guess, from Trump there.
And you mentioned some of those key swing states. A CNN poll this week had Harris and Trump effectively neck and neck. Do you think some of that polling's having an effect on the Trump campaign's responses and behaviour in the past week?
I think so. I think the campaign is very worried about those swing states in particular because, of course, when Biden was the nominee, it looked like Trump had a number of those swing states stitched up. The Biden campaign had given up on states like North Carolina, for example. It seemed like they were out of contention, but that seems to have changed pretty dramatically. And I mean, all the polls are kind of giving different indications on those particular swing states. But overall, in terms of the national popular vote, it's looking pretty bad for Trump. 538, the Nate Silver poll had them today, at the time of recording, Trump sitting on 45 and Harris sitting on 51%. So pretty significant gap. And I do really think that's worrying the Trump campaign. You can see that in the way that he is lashing out and kind of flailing. We've talked before about how he's not even able to settle on a nickname for Kamala Harris, which has really thrown him, I think. But there are also indications kind of on the periphery of the Trump campaign that they're getting really worried. So a number of Trump's, what we might call Trump's surrogates in the social media sphere, the kind of right-wing podcasters and influencers, a number of them have come out in the last few weeks to express their concern about how the campaign is going. Of course, they don't direct that at Trump himself. They wouldn't dare do that, but they've started attacking, his campaign manager and the staff around him, saying that he's getting bad advice or that he needs to lean in more to his conservative far-right base in order to win, and he's not doing that. So they're kind of, I guess, laying the groundwork for laying responsibility for a loss at the feet of Trump's campaign and his staff, which again is a pretty good indication of how worried they are.
Mm. And speaking of the social media giants, Elon Musk this week put up his AI-generated image of Comrade Kamala. He seems intent on continuing to insert himself in the conversation. How are you seeing that playing out at the moment?
Yeah, he is absolutely right, intent on being kind of central to the narrative and directing the kind of campaign narrative. And he is clever in that social media sense, in that they do that kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge jokes about Harris. That image that you're talking about of Harris kind of in a weird generic communist uniform was a shocking image, it's not even well constructed. So you have these kind of layers of jokes where they are kind of serious about calling Kamala Harris a communist, but can walk away from it when people kind of point out to them how ridiculous they are and say they were joking all along. So he's very much kind of leaning into that tried and true tactic of the far right on social media. And he's also, all in for Trump. He's certainly not disguising that anymore. He's tweeted his enthusiasm for potentially having a role in the Trump administration. Trump has said he'll give him a role in something like, I can't remember the exact title, but something like efficiency in government, reducing red tape and all of those cliches. But I think it's really interesting to watch all of these very high profile people get promises from Trump that they'll get things out of him, that Elon Musk will get a position in the administration. Trump has also apparently promised Robert F. Kennedy Jr. a position in his administration. And I think it's interesting to see them all assume that Trump's going to follow through on those promises. But yeah, Musk is, apparently donating money to super PACs, not necessarily to the campaign directly, but to influence the campaign. And probably on a more serious note, that is deeply concerning, given that Twitter still has a huge influence on political discourse in the United States, how people understand the campaign and how journalists understand the campaign in particular. So it may not have as many people there and as much influence in that sense, but in terms of setting the narrative, it's certainly still really important. And Musk knows that, and he knows he has a huge amount of power.
Musk has received this promise from the Trump campaign of some sort of involvement in a potential Trump administration. Why do you think the Trump campaign would be making this kind of promise? Is it to keep the crypto bros on side or for some other reason?
I think it's partly, definitely, to keep the crypto bros on side. I think that's been a big focus of the Trump campaign, partly because he has people in his world who are very much kind of focused on that online space, on cryptocurrency in particular, and the freedom of the internet. It's part of a kind of bigger tension in the Trump campaign between, I guess what we'd call more traditional conservatives and the kind of younger libertarian wing of that movement, which Trump wants to keep happy because he wants their votes, he wants their influence, because of course they have huge influence online, and also they have really deep pockets. So this is why Trump has kind of engaged in the NFT space, which I highly recommend looking up. Some of the images that Trump sells of him kind of dressed as a superhero are quite amazing. So there is that. There are quite clear financial and campaign reasons for him to be engaged in that space. But I also think it's pretty cynical, because if we kind of look at the two figures of Musk and Trump, that's two massive egos. And we know Trump doesn't like competing for attention. He doesn't like other people who have massive egos around him. He wants to be the biggest ego. But I think he, cynically, I think he wants Musk on side, again, because of those really deep pockets and because of the huge influence. I think Trump still kind of harbors resentment of being kicked off Twitter and losing his influence. It's easy to forget how important Twitter was to Trump's political ascendancy. It was critical to it. And, he used it all through his presidency. I think it's easy to forget the kind of wild experience of Trump tweeting, from the White House at 3 a.m. And that's a very kind of Elon Musk energy. That's what they do. So it is this kind of particular approach to the hypermasculine ego that I think Trump kind of finds both attractive and repellent at the same time. And so it does become this really weird, cynical dynamic where I think they both think they're playing four-dimensional chess and using each other. How that actually plays out, who in the end kind of wins that battle really remains to be seen. But, Musk's play in particular is a really intriguing one because I don't think he even kind of knows what his ultimate aim is there. But I do think they're both using each other.
Mm. And it wouldn't matter so much if the stakes weren't quite so high.
Exactly. Yeah, if American democracy wasn't at stake, it might be a bit funnier, but actually it's kind of scary.
Stephanie Grisham served as chief of staff and press secretary to First Lady Melania Trump and then served as the White House press secretary under former President Trump. But she became the first senior staffer to resign on January 6th.
I became the first senior staffer to resign that day.
This week featured another extraordinary moment in American politics.
Former Congresswoman Liz Cheney becoming the latest high-profile Republican to endorse Vice President Kamala Harris.
And her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, long considered among the most conservative and partisan Republicans in the land.
Yeah, I've been voting for 40 years. My first vote I ever cast was for Ronald Reagan in 1984. I've never voted for a Democrat.
Wow.
And it tells you, I think, the stakes in this election.
In our nation's 248-year history, Dick Cheney wrote, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump.
So moving in a bit from the far right into the broader Republican Party, this week Liz Cheney came out in support of Harris, and she's joined Stephanie Grisham, the former Trump White House press secretary, and Jean Becker, George H.W. Bush's chief of staff. What effect do these kinds of defections have on the race?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, Alice, because it's so hard to measure. I don't think anybody is even remotely surprised by Liz Cheney coming out in support of Harris. She's been saying that for a long time, really, that she'd support Biden or anyone really who's opposed to Trump. I think it's more about Trump for Cheney than it is about his opponent. I don't think Cheney or Grisham or any of those figures necessarily change anyone's mind or have a huge influence on the campaign. What they might do is reassure some independent voters or some borderline never Trump Republicans who do exist in those swing states, that it's okay for them to vote Democrat in this instance because Trump is so bad. And so it could have an influence in some of those important swing states in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin. And clearly the Harris campaign thinks that is valuable because they have had some of those figures speaking as surrogates. They featured them at the Democratic National Convention. But overall, I don't think it makes a huge difference. I think if people are kind of wavering against Trump already, then that's not necessarily going to kind of tip them over the edge. And I think generally speaking in American politics, and like probably in Australian politics as well, a bit too much is made of so-called independent voters or swing voters and the influence they have on electoral outcomes. I think particularly in the United States, it's much more about voter turnout and mobilization than it necessarily is about that kind of mythical swing voter. Like it's hard to imagine somebody who's kind of swinging between Harris and Trump, given the contrast between those two campaigns. They do exist, but how much of an influence they have, I'm not sure.
Mm. And what are the key points of departure between the two campaigns and arguably between the two parties is policies on guns? And there's just been another horrific school shooting in the States this week. At her first campaign rally in July, Harris said that her administration would pass red flag laws, universal background checks, and an assault weapons ban. Should she be the successful candidate for president, do you think that there is a chance that there could actually be change this time round? Or do you think that it's more likely for the status quo to continue?
Unfortunately, Alice, I think it's much more likely that the status quo will continue. You know, this has been an issue that's plagued American politics now for decades, and there have been promises from Democrats for decades to do something significant about gun violence and particularly access to automatic and semi-automatic weapons. You know, we can go back to the 2020 Democratic National Convention where you have Gonzalez, who is an advocate for gun control after the Parkland massacre. They went to Parkland and were part of that massacre. You know, they spoke beautifully at the Democratic National Convention. You can go back to ones before that and have, you know, very similar experiences where children and parents are making the same arguments and calling for gun reform, and Democrats are promising to do it with exactly those kinds of measures that you mentioned, the red flag laws and control of semi-automatic weapons. The problem is that would require full control of Congress by the Democrats and a political appetite to do it, because they have had Congress and the White House at the same time before, you know, at the start of Barack Obama's administration, for example, where they had the White House, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and could have passed a number of pieces of legislation, not just around gun reform, but around, you know, reproductive rights, for example. But it does require a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, so a significant majority so that, you know, Republicans or people opposed to gun reform can't basically kind of hold things up until there's no time to pass legislation again, which they've been very successful at doing. So it's certainly possible that Harris could enact some reforms. You know, she can do things through executive order, but genuine reform, genuine change would require them to win the House of Representatives and the Senate. And at the moment, it's looking more positive for the Democratic campaign, but it doesn't look like they will be able to do that. And certainly I don't think there's any suggestion that they'd get that filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. It looks like the Senate will be split, you know, 49 to 51 again, or along similar lines. So unfortunately, that kind of devastating feature of American politics, which is horrifying. You know, I was reading just this morning on CNN the text messages between parents and children who were at this school in Georgia, and it's like, it just makes you feel physically ill, and it is an extraordinary, horrifying, just completely inexplicable feature of American politics that is allowed to continue, but it is. And you can already see, you know, probably by the time even this recording is released, this mass shooting will have fallen out of the news cycle again. You know, it just keeps happening.
Something that has come out over the reporting is that the alleged gunman had been in the sights of authorities, but obviously the action that they've taken was not sufficient. So zooming out a little bit, this week there's been reporting about Kurt Campbell, US Deputy Secretary of State, who met with leaders including Prime Minister Albanese in Tonga. And the two drew some global media attention for the so-called hot mic incident.
Anthony Albanese suggesting that he wants to go Harvey's with the US, some kind of hot mic moment.
Well, we had a cracker today, getting the civic policing initiative.
This is fantastic.
It's so important.
Take the lane.
Oh, you can go as Harvey's on the cost if you like. The video is what it is. Someone, it's up to them to, whoever did that, to think about their own ethics when it comes to journalism.
When Campbell said America had given the lane to Australia to implement the new Pacific-wide policing plan, and Albanese, in his delightfully Australian vernacular, said, "You can go as Harveys in the cost if you like." Has this given us some fresh insight, or do you think it's just more business as usual?
Maybe it's kind of both at once, Alice. As soon as I saw that video and heard Kurt Campbell say, we've given you the lane, or whatever the exact quote is, I kind of wondered to myself, how many essays and articles and books are going to come out shortly with the title like giving you the lane? Like, it's such a perfect quote in that it does kind of sum up Australia's relationship with the United States, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. I think there are a number of things to draw out of that. The first one being that, you're right, that it was characterised as a hot mic moment, but I'm not sure we can really call it that. There was some noise about how they shouldn't have been recorded, but they were standing in a public place where they knew that, press were walking in and out. Like, it was not a private conversation. I don't think there was any hint that it was a private conversation. And I actually think, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I actually think Kurt Campbell knew he was being recorded. That's my kind of reading of his body language. So I think it's interesting that Campbell was speaking that way in a public place where there was significant chance that he was being overheard and potentially even knew that he was being recorded. I think that we could argue that there was a message being sent there, not just to the Prime Minister. So that was interesting from my perspective. I think if we zoom out even further, it's pretty interesting that Kurt Campbell is there at all, given that the United States is not a member of the Pacific Islands Forum for very particular reasons. But of course, Kurt Campbell was there anyway, which tells you a bit. It also tells us a bit that Pat Conroy, the Australian minister, was also kind of hovering in the background while that conversation was happening. Again, I think that's an insight on, kind of how the relationship is treated by the Australian government. But more broadly, I think, it's just a clear indication of how both Australia and the United States behave in the Pacific. You're at the Pacific Islands Forum, so, talking about things that matter to the Pacific, but instead you're kind of there talking to an American, talking to Kurt Campbell about, having your lane cleared in the Pacific for policing issues. And again, that's reflective of Australian and American priorities in the Pacific, which don't line up with the priorities of the actual Pacific, where Pacific nations have repeatedly told Australia and the United States that the thing that most concerns them is catastrophic climate change, which is an existential threat to the Pacific. And instead, Australia and the United States are focused on issues of what we might describe as hard security. They're talking about AUKUS, they're talking about policing, and they're talking about who has the lane and how they use that lane together to counter China. And that is absolutely just a continuation of a long-established pattern of behaviour that, again, doesn't align with the values or the interests of the Pacific, which we are repeatedly told by the Australian government is a priority, and, that Pacific nations are our partners or even our family. But clearly the focus is and has been for a very long time on the United States and on the AUKUS submarine deal in particular. So in that sense, it told us a lot, but it didn't necessarily tell us anything new.
So you mentioned AUKUS, Emma. We're coming up to the third anniversary of this deal. And this week, The Australian republished an article from The Times by Sir Max Hastings, who's a journalist and historian from the UK, in which he quoted a British defence insider as saying, "I don't think our UK submarine sector is remotely capable of delivering what the Australians want on time, on cost, or to standard." So aside from the question of whether or not this is a good use of money, and aside from the question of whether the approval of the AUKUS deal was at all in line with our democratic principles, doubt continues over whether the project is even feasible. Do you see Hastings as being part of a growing chorus of dissent about AUKUS?
Yeah, I do. I think that particular leak, or whatever we want to call it, is really significant because we haven't heard that much out of the UK yet about this. There have definitely been rumblings from outside the UK about the state of the British submarine industry. The Australian government has already handed over, I think, $4 billion to that industry in order to basically kind of keep it going and try and get it to a point where it might one day be able to do some construction for some Australian nuclear-powered submarines. But to have those kind of internal leaks coming out now is, I think, pretty significant and also reflective of that reality that this project is just not feasible on a number of fronts, in terms of the state of the UK's submarine industry, which, as we've just been speaking about, is not great and is already significantly behind on British projects, let alone getting to the point where they can design from scratch and start building Australian nuclear-powered submarines. So there's those questions about the UK. There are very similar questions about the US submarine industry, which we've also handed over 5 billion Australian dollars to, with no guarantee of return, no kind of like deposit arrangement where if we don't get the submarines, we get our money back. None of that. And the US submarine industry is going to have to dramatically ratchet up its own production if it's going to be able to support the construction of these AUKUS submarines. And that's before we even get to the question of Australian capability and the manufacturing expertise and infrastructure and workforce that is going to be needed here in Australia. So in terms of the kind of logistical and material questions around the project, as Hugh White, the defence expert, has put it, every link in the chain is weak. The question is which one breaks first. Right, which I think is a really accurate description of the project. But I think, given that it's the anniversary as well, it's worth zooming out from those technical questions. I think particularly when we're talking about defence and foreign policy in Australia, we tend to get sucked into those kind of technical discussions about capabilities or logistics or manufacturing, what it would take to build and maintain nuclear-powered submarines in Australia. And those are really important questions that we shouldn't shy away from. But they also, I think, sometimes deliberately obscure those bigger moral and strategic questions. Something that's really stood out to us in the last couple of weeks was there was an article, I think it was in the Australian Financial Review, that quoted an American admiral about the kind of training that's going on, in order to get Australian submarine crews prepared for crewing and maintaining nuclear submarines. You've got to do a lot of work. Like every US submarine captain, as I understand it, nuclear submarine captain is a nuclear engineer, right? You need an enormous amount of capability in order to do this that we just don't have in Australia. So the long-term commitment to building up that capability is significant. And as part of the project, what that's going to involve is having Australian crew on US submarines, being trained in how to crew them, how to manage them, etc. But there was a really telling moment where this admiral kind of outlined that the aim is to have 10% of crews on US-flagged Virginia-class submarines be Australians. But I think what's kind of buried underneath that, if we take that project aim and the almost certainty that the AUKUS project more broadly will fall over at some point, I think that there's a strong possibility that what will happen is we will have US-flagged nuclear-powered submarines instead porting in Australia. So instead of having Australian-flagged AUKUS submarines, we'll have US-flagged nuclear power submarines home basing in Australia, off places like Western Australia, with 10% of their crew being Australian and, Australian crew who have kind of grown up within the American system and on American flagged submarines. What that potentially means is that, and I think what it quite deliberately means, is that Australia becomes almost completely locked into American strategic decision-making. So we lose any independent ability to make decisions about our own security and our own future. Because if you have those arrangements, what that means is, in this worst case scenario that the Americans decide for whatever reason to go to war with China, and of course this is all about China and containing China and maintaining American primacy, if you have the Americans decide to go to war with China over Taiwan or for whatever reason, not only in this scenario would an Australian government have to say no to following the Americans into that conflict, which we know is a big stretch given the history of our relationship with the United States, not only would they have to say no, they would have to actively delay the deployment of American submarines in order to extract Australian crew from them. Which at the moment, at least, is pretty impossible to imagine an Australian government doing that. Not only saying no to the Americans, but actively delaying their deployment in order to pull Australians out. Like, that doesn't seem like something that an Australian government would do. Which, when you kind of step back from it, is a pretty scary prospect.
Yeah, and even to reach that point, the Defense Department has just spent about $62 million over the past couple of years on a recruitment drive. And you will be unsurprised to hear that we don't have any figures on how successful that recruitment drive was. But were this scenario to play out, would there be the submariners who would be in that position? As to reiterate Hugh White's point, so many weak links in this chain. It's really hard to see it progressing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a real question about those submariners. You know, we don't have them. We can't even kind of crew our own, let alone crewing extra submarines. And so it is that kind of really long-term project, but there are really significant questions about workforce. And I think that's, you know, again, to zoom out, that's the really concerning thing, is that, you know, everybody knows, like, these are smart people who are dealing with this. Everybody knows that this project is almost certain to fail. And so what are the arrangements that are being put in place instead that we don't know about? Because, like, all of these security issues, you know, most of the time we're not allowed to know about them. And so for me, that's the really concerning thing. Not only that the whole thing is a bit of a joke, but what are the very, very serious consequences of all of that?
Well, thank you so much for breaking down all of the very serious consequences for us, and for talking through the stakes of the US presidential campaign over the past week. Dr. Emma Shortis, you've been an excellent guest on your own podcast. Thank you very much.
You've been such an excellent host. Thank you so much, Alice.
Thank you.
If you're after more American content, this Thursday, the 12th of September at 11 a.m, we are hosting a live webinar with Nick Bryant to pick apart the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and the state of the race more generally. All the details for that are in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 6th of September, and no doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd be super grateful if you subscribed on your podcast platform of choice. You can reach out to us with feedback and episode or guest ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Or you can find us on Elon Musk's Twitter at the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. And we'll be back next Tuesday with a very special guest, Dr. Terry Givens, who's a professor of race, ethnicity and politics at the University of British Columbia. Until then, I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.